Recently, if you've been paying attention at all, there have been two more cases. It's becoming more and more frequent that this happens. Two more cases of innocent people who have been imprisoned in jail for crimes that they did not commit. One was a guy named Stephen Barnes in Oneida, New York. He spent 20 years in jail for a rape and a murder that he did not commit. And the thing that was the balancing thing in the court's mind when he was tried 20 years ago was a witness, a supposedly eyewitness testimony. And he had always maintained his innocence, and they did DNA testing, which they're starting to do more and more often. And the DNA testing proved that he was innocent, and the eyewitness then recanted on his testimony. So a person spent 20 years in jail for nothing, for a crime that he didn't commit. As you also know, that there were three Ohio men, the last of which was cleared of a murder that they didn't commit, all three of them. The key witness again was, and they spent 39 years behind bars for a crime that they didn't commit, for a murder that they didn't commit. And again, the main thing that tilted the jury's opinion against them to say that they did commit the crime was an eyewitness who was told by the police detectives that he needed to go to court and testify against these three men, because if they didn't, his parents could be arrested. He was 13 years old at the time. And it was his testimony that was the deciding factor that put the three of them behind bars. And they since have found, again, with the help of DNA evidence and the fact that this guy who is now, what's 13 plus 39, 54, 53, 50, early 50s, that had eaten at him his whole life. And he finally went in and said that it was not what he had said. And that was the thing that got them to look at the thing, and all three of the men were released. So you have to ask yourself after a while, what is justice? You know, more and more states are putting a moratorium on the death penalty because so many of these things have been coming up that they want to wait and make sure before they take a person's life that the person is actually guilty of the crime. In the case of those three men that were imprisoned in Ohio, one of them was supposed to be executed for that murder, and there was a glitch in the paperwork. People would call it, in fact, if they said at the time, people were saying it was one of those legal technicalities that lets off people that are guilty from being punished for their crimes. Well, it turns out that sometimes those legal technicalities are a blessing. So I think it's a good idea that more and more states are putting a moratorium on the death penalty until they can get some things better in line. The point is, what is justice? What is justice in cases like that? How is justice going to be done? How can you ever give back to somebody? I mean, most of those people will, sue the state for wrongful conviction. They'll get some money out of it. But how do you give back somebody? How do you get justice for having taken most of your adult life away from you in prison? What does justice look like then? And what is justice in general? How do we even know what justice is? In the text today, I was struck as I was reading it that again and again it said that this servant who is coming, that the prophet Isaiah prophesies, it says in three different places in that text that he is going to bring justice to the nations. And as you all know, I've said this before, whenever a word is repeated like that, it's God's way of saying, this is important. Justice is a big part of what the suffering servant, the servant, is going to do when he comes. And so it behooves us to pay attention to that role of the servant who is coming, that he is going to bring justice. A little bit of background, very little bit. today. So we want to look at this idea of justice and some other things about the servant. A little bit of background is that in Isaiah, there are these 3 or 4 poems that are called servant songs. And they are considered by most Christians in Christian hindsight to be prophecies about the Messiah. Doesn't mean that Isaiah, when he wrote this, said, oh, there's going to be a guy named Jesus coming pretty soon. No, it just means that he had this prophecy and that there was going to be a coming servant. Sometimes Israel is said to be the servant. Sometimes it's an unnamed person. Sometimes you almost get the idea that it's Isaiah himself. But the point is that these poems talk about a coming servant of the Lord who is going to bring forth justice to the nations and to the peoples. Has anybody ever seen the movie The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean? I was going to show a clip from that movie, but again, I didn't think the clip would be appropriate for church. But if you get a chance to watch that movie, Judge Roy Bean will give you some ideas about justice, at least one idea. In fact, we were talking this morning, what's that guy's name? Ben Stone? Ben Stone. You'll get some ideas about justice reading his story. He was over in Lucky, thank goodness. Just kidding. He said that was a story about Lucky. I said, well, anyway, justice. Justice. What is justice? In the Old Testament, the word for justice, the Hebrew word is mishpat. Write that down. That's got to be worth something somewhere. It's an important word. It's used over 200 times in the Old Testament. Mishpat, justice. And basically, the basic foundational meaning of justice is, in the Old Testament, that all people are treated fairly, equitably, under the law. That's the basic meaning of it. Now, for most of us, that's no surprise. Of course, that's what justice is. Justice means that all peoples are treated fairly under the law. The interesting thing is that in Israel, in the Old Testament, the idea of being under the law extended to a somewhat greater extent than what we would extend it, I think. In other words, there's a place in Leviticus 24, verse 22, that says that you shall have the same law for the native-born person and for the alien, for the stranger who may be sojourning through you. You shall have the same law for everyone in the land. The same law, and everyone is treated by that same law, whether you're a native-born Israelite or not. Justice means everybody is treated fairly under the law. Now, by extension, that means, and it goes to this extension in the Old Testament, anyone who does wrong should get the same penalty, regardless of whether they're whatever race they may be from, even whatever religion they may be from, because there were non-Israelites living amongst the Israelites, and the same law was to apply to them that applied to the Israelites. The same law was supposed to apply no matter what social status, whether you were rich or poor. The same law was to apply to everyone. And now this is the important extension that it means in the Old Testament, and by extension also in the New Testament. It means that people were to receive what was due to them, whether it was punishment under the law or their rights under the law. In other words, it was not just, justice didn't apply just to punishment. And I think most of the time when we think of justice, we think of people getting what they deserve. If they do wrong, they get the punishment. That's part of justice. But the other part of justice is that everyone gets what they deserve. They get their rights under the law. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 18, the priests are to live by offerings from the people. The people were required to give a certain percentage of their income to support the priests. And do you know what that support was called? Mishpat. The mishpat that the priests received was their due. It was their justice from the people. So justice had more than just a legal connotation. It meant that whatever it was that you were to receive, you were to get. regardless of your status. Whatever the law said you were to receive, you were to get. Now, that's why in the Old Testament, there are a number of people who are brought up in almost every discussion about justice. And I'll tell you who they are in just a second. But the reason why there are certain groups of people that are brought up when justice is talked about is because justice is not evenly distributed amongst the people. Or another way of saying that is injustice is not evenly distributed amongst the people. There are people who tend to suffer from injustice more than others. The rich, for example, don't often suffer injustice. They can buy or bribe their way out. They can prove their innocence. They have more resources at their command. So the rich generally don't suffer from, at least in the Old Testament. We haven't gotten to the New Testament, and we haven't gotten to today yet. But in the Old Testament, generally speaking, the rich didn't suffer injustice at the same rate or the same degree as the poor did. So, you always get people being mentioned in all the conversations about justice, like the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the alien or the stranger. Those were the people most likely to be oppressed because they had no one to speak up for them. In fact, that's one of the reasons why God is often said in the Old Testament and the New Testament to be the defender of the poor, the defender of the orphans, the defender of the widows, the defender of the aliens, the non-Israelites living amongst the Israelites in their nation. God has a special concern for them. That's hard for us to hear because we're so used to thinking that it's the same thing for everybody. Yes, it is the same thing for everybody, but that doesn't happen most of the time. In every society, there are people who generally tend to suffer injustice more than others. Let me read you something from a guy named Tim Keller, who's Presbyterian, by the way, but not our stripe of Presbyterian. He's a PCA Presbyterian in New York City, but I try not to hold that against him. He's a good guy nonetheless. He says, this is why, if you look in every place the word is used in the Old Testament, mishpat he's talking about, several classes of people usually continually come up. Over and over again, mishpat describes taking up the cause and the care of widows, orphans, immigrants, non-native Israelites, and the poor. Those who have been called the quartet of the vulnerable. And then he quotes Zechariah 7. This is what the Lord God Almighty says. Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the immigrant or the poor. In pre-modern agrarian societies, these four groups had no social power. They lived at subsistence level and were only days from starvation if there was any famine, invasion, or even minor social unrest. Today, this quartet would be expanded to include the refugee, the migrant worker, the homeless, and many single parents and elderly people. The mishpat, or justice of a society, according to the Bible, is evaluated by how it treats these groups. Any neglect shown to the needs of the members of this quartet is not only called merely a lack of mercy or charity, but a violation of justice. God loves and defends those with the least economic and social power, and so should we. That's what it means to do justice. So doing justice is more than just seeing that everybody gets what they deserve. Doing justice means making sure that the most vulnerable are receiving what they need in the eyes of the law and in their own lives. It's interesting. The Bible over and over and over again says that God is the defender of the poor and the immigrant and the orphan and the widow. It never once says that God is the defender of the rich. That should give us pause to think, what does it mean? that God is always said to be the defender of those groups, but not of other groups. What it means is it's a recognition that there are certain people that don't get justice as often as they should. I think that's something that we need to bear in mind, because in the same way that God evaluated the Old Testament society by how well it treated the least of those among them, God will evaluate our society and us by how we treat those same people. So it's important to keep that in mind. And we always bring it up at Christmas, you know. It's always like, well, we're going to get the angel tree. Well, we got to be thinking about that all year long, not just at Christmas. We got to be thinking about how can we make sure that people who are the most vulnerable have what they need to merely subsist. And think about it all year long. Tim Keller says that, but not that he's anything great. John Calvin says that. I've read you a number of quotes. One of them is always up here on the offering slide, of what Calvin says about what we should do with what we have. Luther says the same thing. Wesley says the same thing. John Chrysostom in the 4th century says the same thing. Augustine in the 5th century. There's a uniform voice of the church from the beginning until today that says that we as the church have to be careful how we treat the most vulnerable among us. So it's important to keep that in mind. I have all these things going through my head, and I didn't write them down. I'm going to have to resist the open door to the sidetrack, because we'll be gone for a long time. So maybe it would be worth examining a little bit during Advent, this preparation time when we prepare to celebrate the coming of Jesus. Why is it that there's a little bit of resistance in us when we hear that? Because I know when I hear that, for me, there's always this little bit of resistance. What do you mean God prefers the poor? God has a prejudice towards the poor. God's a defender of the poor, but not the rich. Why is that? It might be good to take some time and think about that over Advent. What is it in us that kind of has a resistance at making sure that the most vulnerable are given justice? What is their due? Okay, enough about justice. The servant also has, besides an agenda, justice for the nations, he also has a method. The servant is not going to, thank God, the servant is not going to bring justice like Judge Roy Bean or Ben Stone. The servant doesn't bring justice like that. In the end of Judge Roy Bean, there's a great scene. This is what I wanted to show. He's in a hotel, and the people of the town are all mad because he's made it a rule. He's not a very good judge, actually. But he's made it a rule that all of the women of the night are to keep company with the people on the town council, to keep them out of trouble. Quote. And he's been one of those people that will just, find somebody that's doing something wrong and just, shoot them. No due process, no nothing. And so at the end of the movie, the people get upset with him and they want to throw him out. And they set the hotel on fire where he's staying, and he comes running out onto the roof and he's shooting his guns at people. And somebody says, "What's your name?" "My name's Judge Roy Bean, you SOBs." Sometimes I think we look at justice a little bit in categories like that. Justice means somebody coming in and kicking butt and taking names and putting people on the right track. That's not what justice is. At least that's not what the servant's agenda and method for justice is. Listen to verse 2. I'm going to read this again. I think this is a great thing. "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick, a dim wick, he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged." You see, he has a methodology as well. And the methodology is not to raise his voice in the street. Next time you hear somebody, screaming at people on the street corner with the Bible, you should go up there and just read that verse to them. He will not raise up his voice in the streets or yell out. He brings forth justice quietly through his people. Nowadays, he brings forth justice quietly through his people. He will be gentle. He doesn't break off bruised reeds. He doesn't snuff out dimly burning wicks. He's going to be a light to the nation, to open the eyes of the blind. And then you get that language in the second part of this text that you know Jesus did. He opens the eyes of the blind. He heals the lame. He heals the leper. He does those things because that's his way of bringing about justice. That's part of what justice is when it comes. The New Testament lesson, which was read, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned and revealed them to little children. He's not talking about the little children that we have up here for the children's sermon. He's talking about people who are children, the disciples, the people who are like sheep without a shepherd, the people who are lost and need help, the people who are the poor. That's the children that God has revealed this to. Yes, Father, for this was your good pleasure. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and the Father the Son except for those whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. That's the servant speaking. That's the servant's method. That's the servant's agenda. That's the church. That should be our method and our agenda as well. And lastly, and this I think is the most striking thing in two of the servant songs, is this. There's a striking phrase in verse 6 of chapter 42. It says this: I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people. There's only two places in the whole Bible where it talks about a person being a covenant for the people. All the other places where it talks about a covenant, it's God makes a covenant with some people, and there's like an agreement that's written down, the Ten Commandments or whatever it is. God makes a covenant. He makes an agreement. But in this place, a person, the servant, is said to be the covenant. God is going to make that servant the covenant for the people. Who can that be? Who can that be that is going to be the covenant for the people? Could it be the one who says, this is my body broken for you? This is my blood shed for you for the remission of sins? Let's close in prayer.